Good evening. I mean, if
Good.
some of you can turn your audio off, that would be very helpful because I don't like it when I sort of hear people say, well, that's rubbish, and he's not right on that. So if you can keep that to yourselves. My name's Carl. I live in Cheshire. I've been keeping bees now since 2003, so 20 and a bit years. I've tried playing around with all different types of beekeeping and playing around with my bees and other people's bees all over the country. And I've absolutely enjoyed it. And I'm finding that I settle down with a fair few dozen hives, but I love rearing queens and I like trying to find ways to improve them. And by improving them, I mean that they're gentle and they're sort of not too runny on the comb. They're hardy in that they tend to look after themselves, and they are productive. By productive, I mean that they make enough honey for themselves and a bit more for me. Um, I've I've actually confessed to being treatment free since 2018 with my bees. I don't recommend doing it cold turkey. There's a process to do that, and that'll be worth talking through on another chat. There's a conference going on, like I said, next month on that one. But what I wanted to do is explore looking ahead another 10 or 15 years in my beekeeping and try to find somebody that was 10 or 15 years further on than me, that's keeping a shed load of hives. And the opportunity came to visit Mike Palmer last June. I went with Roger Patterson and Martina Hendry, uh, and we sort of paid for the trip ourselves. And we were over there for 12 days to figure out what was happening. And I mean, Mike is an absolutely brilliant person. He and his partner were just so helpful, courteous, gave us loads of time, loads of space, let us experiment with things and play with things. So we'll just get stuck into it. It was quite good. I had to drive down to Heathrow to catch a plane and then ended up flying back over my house in Cheshire to get um, to North America. Vermont is where they're going. Ended up flying over Greenland back in the good old days when Greenland wasn't potentially being taken over by something else. And this was Greenland. I'd never seen anything like this before in my life, but there's actually icebergs in there and everything. Flying over Canada was an experience, just seeing the long roads, just going into the distance and the whole grid structure. I mean, America is on a scale that is just so enormous. It was fantastic. Then we landed in Canada, and then drove across to America. And Vermont is where we went to, but it's in New York State. So we're seeing a New York sign, but don't worry, we never saw a skyscraper or anything on our trip. One of the things we had to do when we crossed the border was have our fingerprints taken. So the border crossing was nice. This is Roger having his fingerprints taken. So if anybody wants to tell in the future if he's done anything wrong, there is a set of fingerprints available. You can see the police border man next to it, but it's quite serious stuff. And we had to pay to have our fingerprints taken as well. So that's that. And we turned up to this idyllic sort of farmhouse type thing. Absolutely lovely. This is the veranda where we spent most of the mornings and evenings either planning bits for the day, what we're hoping to get, or trying to decipher what we saw yesterday, or in the evening just talking through what we understood. And it was lovely. Uh, Martina organized all of this, and it was brilliant. When we looked into the kitchen, first of all, this is the first kitchen we saw, which was a little bit unnerving, but actually, this was just there for show. So, this is the actual kitchen, which is probably the smallest room in the house by a million miles, but we didn't have much time to eat actually because we went and got on doing stuff all the time. When we went over to see Mike, straight away we're sort of confronted with piles like this. There was a lot going on. He was obviously busy into his season. He's got several hundred queen rearing colonies, slightly unclear, but he's got a load of colonies for making queens as well. and as well as making queens, making the brood and the food to support them. And I'll be trying to talk through what we saw, but it literally was a working farm. And you'll notice a fair few nuke boxes there, and he has a lot of them. And I'll try to explain how that was used and how flexible they are. Just whether or not you want to raise colonies or you just want to have them as hives as well. Again, just at the side of his shed, he's got beehives wrapped or boxes wrapped up, and as he says, don't mind the bears. So that's a little bit unnerving on your first morning, realizing that you're in the woods and everything, and possibly having to keep an eye out for bears and so on. But I think he was just kidding us. A lot of kits around, and a lot of it has been using for many, many years. Um, When you start to look at some of the boxes, it looks like Egyptian hieroglyphs. And this is just, again, a working hive. All this stuff on here means something to Mike. And I had absolutely no idea what it meant when we arrived. But by the end of it, I had a pretty good idea. And I've interpreted this and come up with what I think is a slightly simpler way of doing it, because the trouble is you can only write so many things on a hive before it gets totally confusing like this. But we understood what was needed when you're raising queens and just keeping control of the colonies. So that was nice and easy. This is part of the gang. Uh, Mike is second from the left, in case anyone doesn't recognize him. But we have people over at the right from Mexico, from Puerto Rico, and from somewhere down south in America, the guy with the sort of hat at the back, and Roger and Martina in the middle. But there were a whole host of other people as well, just involved in getting stuff moving on, and it all just seemed to work in a sort of smooth, choreographed fashion that, like I said, I just didn't understand because there was so much going on. You get a glimpse of the hives behind me, and this is what we walked into on the first morning, and oh my goodness, what's going on? Yeah. It didn't take long for Roger to start explaining to Mike how beekeeping should be done. So Mike was very patient. He listened. If you can see, Mike's got a plaster on his hand. He'd hurt his hand, so he's actually a bit appreciative for some of the help. Behind is one of the mating apiaries. You can see a few nukes laid out. Again, it all looked higgledy-piggledy to start off with and didn't know what was going on. But very quickly, after 2 or 3 visits to different places at different times, it was quite easy to sort out. Now, some of you might think that you can't keep beehives close to sheep and donkeys and horses and that. But if you can see a couple of horses in the field, they're happily meandering around in amongst 100+ mating nukes, causing absolutely no problem at all. So sometimes we're told certain things, but it doesn't always turn out to be like that in reality. I'll try to show you a few bits of video. Mike was actually taking the time all the time to talk through what he was doing. You can see he's mic'd up, and what we will be doing is trying to split some of these off into individual videos with a lot more explanation around each one. But he was always wanting to explain carefully about what was going on and why. And if I just click into it, looking in, and he would go through things time and time again so we understood what was going on. Oh, not sure what's going on there. This is one of his breeder colonies. So in here are his most important bees and the ones that he takes all the larvae from. He actually keeps the queen over at the left-hand side of the brood box and has a vertical queen excluder 3 frames in. So he knows exactly where the queen's laying, and it makes it much, much easier when he's actually getting the larvae out. Oh, let me just stop that one. when we start to dig into these colonies, yeah, this is Rodriguez. He's just having a look in. They have these cloths on top rather than crown boards as such. It's just easier to do. Ten, and if you could, can you see the queen excluder roughly where his finger is? Can you guys hear the sound on this?
No.
No? Okay, good. Right, I'll turn that off then because it's confusing me. So the queen is on the side where the three frames are with the queen excluder. And obviously, if you put a frame of drawn comb in there, the queen will lay straight onto it. So 4 days later, absolutely brilliant to go in and get a whole frame of good quality larvae. And then those that he doesn't use, he sort of moves them down the rest of the brood box and just picking them out like this to have a look. And this is typical of his sort of breeder colonies. And I think he had 5 of these, but 4 he was getting larvae from on a regular basis. It was a bit much to take on first time round, but this is what we were seeing. One of the things as well, you might notice Mike's not wearing a veil or gloves, and uh, sometimes you'll see people wearing veils because this is sort of most invasive thing you're doing when you're digging right into a hive to have a good look through, looking for swarm cells, looking for eggs and larvae, and just making sure everything's okay. But the bees were calm pretty much all the time. So, right, I'll just try to move on, he says. No one. So this is fairly typical of what a beehive would look like, uh, full of bees. It's a simple way of doing it. They were calm. They rarely needed smoking, and they varied in coloration. You can see quite a vary there. There's a fair amount of sort of yellow in them. I don't really know and can't calibrate myself on what is typical for American ones, but he had some extraordinarily gentle bees. It took probably a day or two to get confident about not wearing a veil at all. And other than that, we just carried on then, almost always, just handling the bees without any fuss at all. Uh, Here's a queen on a frame, various colours. I'm not going to judge on that because it's not my place to judge. I'm not sure what all the different colorations mean in America because obviously bees are not native to America, so they're all brought in and bred on and on. But this is typical of what we were finding. But some of them did go to a much more orangey color and even towards yellow, and some of them were darker than this. It really just depended on the queen at the time. We get to see a lot of queens because we were breeding them over the days we were there. Having got the frame of young larvae out of the breeder colonies, straight away they would just sit there in the van and graft into the cups you can see there. We were watching. It was just a simple technique. This was 10 yards away from the hives. They just shook the bees off or brushed them off with a brush. And there was a particular technique they use with a bee brush. I don't use a bee brush, but they do. And they use it in a flicking motion. So rather than roll the bees, they were literally just flicking the bees off the frames. And it seemed to work very well. I liked what they did. They were grafted. A typical row there, I think, has got 16 cells on, and they would put 3 rows into a grafting frame. Roger had a go at grafting because it was quite hands-on all the way through, and they allowed us to do this and allowed us to use those ones for the queen rearing process. We're also very keen to put pollen in. And when I say put pollen in, obviously got some kind of pollen catcher. I didn't actually see that being done, but they would have a lot of it, and they would literally pour it into the cells, brush it in, and then tamp it in with their hands so that it's solid pollen. So this would go next to the frame of grafted larvae. Uh, and I'll see if I can show this picture. When they were trying to get a lot of bees, what they would do is turn a hive around like this, and then when they put the frame of grafted larvae into a box at the back, all of the bees from this beehive would return back to the original position and then absolutely pile into the cell raising uh, box. And they just thought nothing of moving whole hives like this. And they're full of bees, which I've never seen that before. Never even contemplated doing that, but this is something I'll be practicing during the course of this year. Oh, sorry. There were bees everywhere, and just to make sure that when they put the frames in, there were enough bees. They would literally put the roofs in front and just go and shake bees from other colonies on there to give a complete abundance. Cannot have too many bees in the cell raiser colonies, and certainly with the numbers they're doing, sort of up to 48 at a time in each colony cell raising. They just constantly were shaking bees in like this, and the flying bees, the mature ones, would tend to take to the wing and go back to wherever they came from. But the younger nurse bees that haven't got to the flying stage would literally just walk up into the hive, and they would be there to feed the larvae, but also to create the queen cells as well. Um, just trying to, and you end up with boxes like this, which were just oozing with bees, and in there were frames of queen cells being made. And it wouldn't be long before we go back and see how they were doing. Again, just another view. They would also put a box on top with a queen excluder and shake bees in. So in amongst there will be the frame of grafted cells, but they would shake more bees in from the top as well. The gaffer tape at the top, you may have heard or seen that if you're shaking bees in, they rather than walk up the side when they get to the gaffer tape, they just stop there. I've sort of seen it because I've done it with a few hundred bees, but they were doing it with thousands, and it is very effective of keeping the young bees in the box. So the only real option they've got is to go downwards, which is exactly where they wanted them to go.
That's good.
And that's just bees in and around and going down. Can you see there's none on the gaffer tape? They just don't go over that barrier.
Don't like walking on it, I suppose.
So they put the frame of grafted larvae in, and then this frame of pollen goes right next to it. So they've got plenty of food. They've turned the hive around, so the foraging bees are coming piling back with nectar, and then it's good to go. This is a close-up view of a frame of brood comb, but it's literally just packed with pollen. And like I said, it's poured on and then just tamped down by hand, patted down so that it is solid. But it crumbles very easily, so the bees can just take it and make as many queens as they wish. There was an absolute abundance of pollen available for them, and that was done every single time. That's one of the frames going in. You can see the bees there again, like I said, overflowing. Maybe not so clear, but down at the bottom of the hive in the front, it's bees outside as well. All lovely and calm, gentle, just wanting to get on with the business of raising queens. And then literally just let them get on with it. Uh, this is Mike, yeah, um, handling bees as you do. When he takes a roof off, he has an empty brew box. He's walking around with it, and he uses as a stepping stone so he can actually reach the top of his hives. Otherwise, they're just a little bit too tall. And bearing in mind, I mean, now, like I said, it's thousands of bees everywhere, but no one's getting stung. The bees aren't landing on anybody, and they're just calm. The hive just to the right, you can see, is overflowing. They're not disturbed by all the commotion going on in this colony. But the queen cells are raised and drawn out, and they're sealed over. And then, as I understand it, and there was lots going on, we were doing it at all different stages. Uh, you store the queen cells in a hive until they're about ready to hatch, and Mike then just plucks them out like this, and then they will be in sort of 45 or so mating nukes within a couple of hours. See the way it just flicks gently with the brush? It seems to work, and it doesn't roll the bees at all. He's got his code numbers on there, and he has things like P1 and 189s and so on. But yeah, really keen, and he just spends time explaining what he's doing, showing the results, and this is just randomly as they appear. So nothing prepared, just normal sort of work for him, just part of his day job. Get rid of that. So they pull them out, and this is typically what we find. Uh, I'll show one there where we've taken the bees off. You can see they're very successful, very high hit rate. Roger had a go at his grafting, and he got 48 out of 48, which I think he was quite pleased about. I was delighted for him as well. We just don't get those numbers in the UK because we can't make that many queens in one go. We might be able to get one row of 16 as a tops, but for most of us mere mortals in the UK, trying to get somewhere between 6 and 10 in one go is good enough. They have an abundance of bees and an abundance of food. That's a simple way to explain it. But the other thing that happens in America is that you have to register your apiaries. And I thought it sounded a bit odd. And by registering them, you also have to pay an annual license to have an apiary. And an apiary is one or more hives. So you have to apply for it. And once you apply for it, each apiary costs $20 a year. And I was like, I'm not so sure this is a good idea until Mike explained the next bit. Once you've got a registered apiary, nobody else is allowed to have an apiary within 2 miles of you. So I mean, it's completely impractical on a small island like the UK. But what it did mean is that there's quite a good amount of forage available to each apiary without too much competition from other bees in the area. Hence the ability, I think, to raise good honey crops, get plenty of pollen, and to raise an abundance of queen cells like this, just rattling them off each 4 days. We found snakes as well. I think Mike said that most of them aren't poisonous, but he sort of said that once they're in your hand. But that was all part and parcel of just where we were. The queen cells will go over to these mating apiaries. Now, in the morning, we would have done queen hunting, going through that lot, and I'll explain that in a minute. I'm just trying to go through a logical process. So got all the queens out and put them into cages, and in the afternoon we would come over and put those queen cells we've just taken out in so that the queenless colonies have got the cells in, and those cells should be hatching within the next day or so. Although it looks a little bit random and haphazard, uh, they're actually laid out in circles. You can probably make out a circle in front of you, a circle over towards the right, and the three or so over to the left are part of another circle. Lots of marking tape on the tops and gaffer tape. The gaffer tape was a pain to get off, but the blue masking tape, so it's like painter's masking tape, was fantastic. So the first thing I did when I came back home was buy 4 reels of that tape, and you can stick it on top of a roof or on the side of a hive, write what you want onto it in terms of the key dates or where the source of the larvae came from, and it's excellent. After that, you can just rip the piece of masking tape off, and you're not confused by a sort of conglomeration of Egyptian hieroglyphs, as I showed you earlier on. The boxes at the bottom here are brood boxes, but they're just old brood boxes. They're empty. That's the way Mike uses his stand. And typically, these ones, yeah, several of these are 4-way nukes up on top. So each side would have an entrance and would have a series of frames. I'll show you inside them shortly. Here's one, yeah. So typical Langstroth type box, and he's made small frames up, and you can see here just placing the queen cells in each of the quadrants. And the bees, we will have just reaped the mated queens that morning from these colonies. He tends to use I think JZ, BZ cups, and they work well. You can see the pale color in the middle is the royal jelly. Queen cells all look fairly consistent in size on all the ones that I saw. Just looking at his colonies as well, fair amount of propolis on his bees. They never fussed about the propolis all the way through. And I know in the UK we used to think that propolis was sticky and gooey and that, but I think we tend to know a little bit more that it's good for sort of keeping the bees healthy with the antibacterial effects and so on. But yes, pretty much all the colonies had this sort of much propolis on them. Mike could invite us over to his house, and that was great. And then he said, yeah, we can talk about beekeeping, but straight away we also into a production line and making up queen cages. And one of us would be putting a gauze in, another one putting the fondant in, and other one putting corks in. And you can see a box there just in front of Martina of the ones we'd made that day. Because we're harvesting queens, I think we got 95 or so queens that day. All the queen cages were full, so he needed another 95 or 100 queen cages for the next batch, which would be available in 4 days' time. Beer was involved, and Mike was very kind and hospitable in that respect. But he would also just talk about his bees, his beekeeping, and just spend time with us. Very, very grateful for that time and that experience. This is one of the queen cages. We tend to have plastic ones in the UK, but there are similar ones in the UK which have sort of look like 3 sort of half drilled holes through where the queens go inside. The interesting thing about this is that the mesh just pushes in and it clicks in place because of its shape. It just wedges itself in. So very simple to make. And when you stack the queen cages on top of one another, there's an air gap, so it doesn't allow the bees to overheat. I think that was a simple but very effective design. This is Mike's personal transport, a yellow and black Jeep and a trailer, and we would turn up and do queen catching and so on days like this. Other people would turn up as well, and there would be some kind of ceremony which would involve various bits of drinking and swapping other bits and pieces and chatting in the morning, and then they would just get on and start working. Again, just looking at one of the mating apiaries. This is an area. I think there would be around about 50 or so boxes there, and there were 3 areas like this in the field. So my thinking is he throws one of his batches of 48 queen cells into that lot, and then 4 days later he does the next lot, and 4 days later he does the next lot, and then he's into sort of harvesting the mated queens and going round in a sort of continual circle like that. Lots of different colors and shapes and styles on the box for identification purposes. Doesn't actually have the boxes under trees. The dappled shade would be useful normally, and on some days it was really quite hot, around about 30 degrees centigrade, but the bees seemed okay where they were, and he's got a wooden lid on top. Most of the lids tended to be a light color so that they weren't absorbing too much heat. And yeah, like I said, different colors and shapes just to help the bees identify which is their home. And various bits of identification. Each one of those labels or bits of gaffer tape is for one of the batches. If you can see the blue sticky tape, brilliant. So that was from Queen 138, and yeah, anyway, it's upside down, but it would have the date, and they write it slightly differently because they put the month first. One of the things that was interesting, because lots of people were hunting for queens, they had a centralized sort of queen marking and caging area. So that got set up. On hot days, it was under a gazebo, and if it were to rain, it would probably be under a gazebo. But it was set up because they were after catching around about 100 queens over the next 2 hours or so. And then it's a case of just going through the hives. This was early doors, so Mike was explaining to Roger what was going on, but very quickly it was, one would work from one side and one works from the other side. Each of the frames in the mini nuke is about half the size of a brood frame, a sort of English type brood frame, and each mini mating nuke would have 5 of these frames. It did give some limitations because the queen could lay it up fairly quickly, but it was big enough to allow the bees to sort of have a stable nuke environment, and just to keep using it over and over again during the course of the summer. Once the queen was found, bearing in mind she's unmarked at this stage, the frame would be taken over for the queen to be marked and caged. This is people just checking. I think this guy's name was Clay. He was quite a character. Introduced me to moonshine. So that was, again, one of the sort of little rituals that went on. But he also made some nice, somewhat strong wines and things. But he was good at spotting the queens, relaxed. I never saw him wear any protective equipment, despite seeing him for several days just doing this over and over again. Other people, like the person behind, could choose to wear a veil. No one was ever judged for things like that. But some people that were a slightly nervous disposition, I was early doors, would be a bit uncomfortable, just sort of exposing all your flesh to the bees, but actually never really a problem. Okay, just another view inside a box. Yep, 100 years of experience, and more than that, actually, probably 115 or so. One's looking through, sometimes look through one box or mini nuke, and one would look through another one trying to find the queen. Never really a problem, just occasionally it would be difficult to find one, and you go through again and again. It might be on the bottom of a box, but usually relatively easy to spot because there were so few frames and relatively few bees. It wasn't too difficult just to get on with. Not really using much smoke. You can see it's not sort of kept too close, and very little risk. Bear in mind there would be other people doing this all around as well, so it's not just this going on. There would be probably 4 or 5 pairs like this, just searching for queens. Yeah, yeah. And they're talking and working. You just get an idea here of sort of pace. So hook one out, have a look, and then Mike would hook the next one out and have a look at that one, just trying to find the queen. Sometimes it would be very quick and easy. Other times, like I said, bit of a fuss to find, but it's just luck of the draw. The temporary storage of the frames here is so that they don't get confused and having to jam everything back in until the queen's been found. It's another group working behind Mike and Roger there, just having a search through. But yes, it was a lovely, relaxing affair just to find the queens once they got found anyway. Well, I think Roger may have got that one there. And I was trying to take some photographs to sort of summarize the scene. So people would park their cars. Ours was the whitish one, maybe. But on this day, probably it was pretty hot. But again, people just working away, doing what they're doing. It was an absolute joy. It was almost like a therapy or a meditation to be queen hunting in this kind of atmosphere and conditions. Here's a queen in a cage. So the mesh obviously keeps it in. They've got corks in each end, and there's a big blob of fondant. The queen at this stage will have been marked, and she's on her own just for a few minutes while the paint dries off. And then the next job is to get the worker bees in there. Again, it's just little tips that I never really had thought about before. They shake a frame of bees onto the table. Obviously, all the mature bees go flying off, but all the younger nurse bees just stay on the table because they're not really flying. So you can just pick them up and put 9 into a cage, and they will be the attendants for the queen. I guess it's possible to get stung by them, but you can see they're just calm and gentle, non-runny. So just pick one up like that, pop it in, it walks in, finger over the edge, next one in, and it's in. And then just next one in, and it's in. And it was very, very simple. Obviously, the queens are mated, so the bees are very interested. Martina here was trying a slightly different way. She was allowing the bees to come to the queen, and that way she didn't have to keep picking them off the table. But again, a good sign of a mated queen. Mm. And this is the box as they're filling up. You might be able to make out some numbers on those wooden boxes. It will say this pile over to the right. It says P1-24. So P1 is the uh, breeder queen that the larvae was grafted from. 24 is 2024. Just stacking them up here, like I said, you can see how they stack so that there's an air gap in between, and it's just being kept out of the sun to keep them fairly stable from a temperature point of view. Yeah, more sort of bits of hieroglyphs and notes on things. We ended up, I was sort of scraping them off because it was confusing about which piece of gaffer tape was actually holding all the information and which one wasn't. So, like I said, I was getting a bit OCD about that in the end because I was getting confused. Some boxes here. I mentioned about having 4-way nukes. He had plenty of 2-way nukes as well. So you can see some here. They're 2-way nukes, yeah, because they're more sort of nuke shaped. So there are two mini nukes in each box. The yellow and blue one over the far end is two boxes together, I believe. Yeah. And Mike just makes little comments like if he has a four-way box, he finds that the mating success isn't quite as good as if he has a two-way box or two-way boxes. Now, read into that what you will, but if somebody with half a century of experience and many, many years doing this is saying things like that, it's worth listening to. Otherwise, it could take several years for us to realize something similar. But my learning point from that is that a two-way mating nuke is probably or possibly more successful at mating queens than, say, a four-way box. Maybe there's a bit of confusion and drifting or whatever, I don't know. Still looking through boxes, finding queens, so on. And yeah, that's me having a go at it as well. Some of the colonies, like this one, a bit busier when you're digging in, and I think I'm starting to lean backwards a bit on that one, but no risk, no worries, and very, very few stings. That's the blue masking tape I mentioned. Having got the queens, the next job is to have some beer, and the queens in those wooden cages went into that white box, and Mike would not leave that box in the vehicle just in case it got too warm or something. So took it into the pub, and it was cheers to all. I think on that day, like I said, 90 or 95 queens collected. So he was happy, and we were delighted, and everybody was just a little bit exhausted and dehydrated. So this was the perfect end to one of the working days. Can't quite see this as I'm looking down onto his coffee table now into his sitting room. He has a very accommodating partner. Mike has sorted out the queens into the different uh, breeder queens. So he's got four or so different breeder queens. So they're in four or so different categories. Didn't always understand exactly what was going on because he also had some left over from maybe 4 days old that he was keeping that he hadn't put into nukes yet or he hadn't sold because he uses some of them himself and he sells a fair amount of them. But this is just a steady flow of queens. He also had a polar bear or a dog that was massive and it was good. Absolutely gorgeous dog and kept us company and would always be better than any doorbell because it would have a sort of very receptive bark as we approached it when we came to the house. This is next morning we would end up in one of Mike's barns, and there would be stuff going on. They would be preparing for the day. Sometimes it's a little bit confusing about what was going on, but the guys would be searching for empty brood frames, or they want more boxes, or they're after some other bits and pieces. But they knew what they wanted, and we would help as best we can. But most of the time, they were just really good at getting on with it, and it just flowed. It just automatically worked. There was a lot of movement of boxes and frames around the place. Yeah, and then Mike just jumps in and gets one of these just to raise the level of intimidation even higher. He wanted some more boxes to raise some more nukes because uh, where he'd got queens and he'd got a market for those queens, that's fine. But when he had a good haul on the queens, he was able to make up some nukes. So one day he just said, "Let's go and make up." I think it was 52 nuke boxes. So to do that, we need to get those on board and get them all sorted. When he was this is one of the apiaries. There's the wire around the side, the electric fence, because bears are a problem. Uh, but he would have a number of boxes available all the time. And what he would want to do is split up the colonies to get resources from them. Now, looking at some of these boxes, perhaps over towards the left, you can see what we would know as a sort of normal sized brood box at the bottom. And these brood boxes were divided in half with a permanently fixed piece of wood, and he would have a queen in each half. So it's about a nuke size, half a brood box, and you would have two queens in each of those bottom boxes, and then he would put the nuke boxes on top and raise them like vertical chimneys of bees. What's good about this is that if a brood box as we know it has got, say, 10 or 12 frames of brood in them, it would be in that bottom box, but it would also be in the next box up as well. So you can dig in and take frames of brood out without having to disturb that bottom box and the entrance. Up above that, you would end up with nectar and honey and so on. And those would be where we'd start harvesting the sealed brood, the open brood, and the food, and we'd also put empty frames in to start making nukes up. Here's an example of a box on the left, what we would know as a sort of typical Langstroth brood box, and then with this permanent piece of wood in the middle, he's using solid floors, and then there's a small entrance on one end for the one of the colonies to go out, and on the opposite end for the other colony to go out. On the right hand side is a picture of these boxes being filled up. And I say being filled up because we would put 4 frames in each box, and it's very particular how it was done. With the frame closest to the middle central divider, that would be a frame, let's get this right, of nectar, okay, or sealed honey, but if it's nectar, that's fine. The frame next to that would be open brood, and then the frame next to that would be sealed brood, and the frame on the outside would be empty. So if you have a look at that box to the right, you can see on the right hand one, frame 1 is in position and frame 3 is in position. So we found a frame of nectar, predominantly nectar, and we found a frame of predominantly sealed brood, and they got in a position. On that left-hand version of it, there's a frame of nectar in there and a frame of sealed brood and a frame that's empty, but obviously we'll be looking for some open brood to go into that one. Now, it was a bit confusing to start off with, but the way I remember it is with the word nose, nectar, open, sealed, empty, Nose, and you just work from the middle out. And I didn't exactly ask why we do it that way, but they do it that way all the time, and it works. So I'm not going to argue against that. But we would just go raking through all the colonies and say, we need some more open brood, or in this case, we need an open one for the left, and we need an open one for the right, and then an empty frame for that right-hand one. Once that's done, just slide those crown boards over, and that one's ready to go. I had a lovely time doing this. This is probably my very best day filling those up. We made 52, and it was wonderful doing that. Absolutely enjoyed it totally. Again, another one's being made up, and stacks of boxes around where we would get these resources from. I was quite shocked that within 2 or 3 hours we could make up 50 plus nukes ready to be transported into a new apiary. All right, yeah. So, oh, in this one, he's actually sliding the queens in. So just open up the middle 2 frames in each one. So that's between the open and sealed brood. and slide it in, and then just squeeze the frames back together to get the normal sort of spacing, and job done. And it literally is as simple as that. And they're ready to get transported then. This is the 52 boxes we made up. And yeah, like I said, it's just absolutely brilliant fun. So in all these boxes are on each side of the four frames on one side and four frames on the other. And then the queen in the cage has gone in as well. They put some straps around them because it was going on the back of a truck. I like the fact that when we did use smokers, which we use from time to time, they had these metal buckets and they put it in there, and that way it stopped any fire risk. There was hay and stuff in the back of the truck, but this was a lovely, simple way to keep the smokers from not falling over and not causing any problems. Again, as soon as I got home, I bought one of these metal buckets, and it was brilliant. And this is what you feel like when you've done it. So, and this was generally the sort of mood. The Spanish music playing with the open door of their truck, and job's done, being loaded, everybody's happy. But we're only half done because we've got to move it all to a new apiary. Oh, sorry. And yeah, I think this we're just tidying up and starting to get things moving over. Again, queens in the cages, nice and comfortable. The bees are always supportive, and obviously the queens are giving off plenty of pheromones. It's attracting interest from everywhere. The bees were just not fussed at all that we were around. Having put all the boxes down, the labels go on, and if you can probably see the blue labels, there's two rows of numbers on there, and that's because one relates to one of the nukes and one relates to the other nuke, which is under that shared roof. Yeah, just steadily working away. So Martina's taken the cork out, which then exposes the nectar to the bees and, sorry, the fondant, beg your pardon, to the bees, and it goes in. Gets closed back up and all sorted. After a hot day making nukes, Mike took us to a place where this is a medium-size ice cream. No idea how big the large ones were, but much appreciated after a hot day. As well as all the normal equipment that Mike had, he just happens to mention he's got one of Brother Adam's uh, mating nukes, so he just showed it to us. So we took it outside, and as we're always curious, took it apart to have a look. There's a box on the inside, and then when we take the box out, we can see the four-way mating nuke. And this is very similar to what Mike has got. And probably Mike says that he built his whole apiary around this model. And the white box on the outside is actually a separate outer box. There's a wooden box on the inside, and that's the wooden box on the inside. So yeah, one of Brother Adam's mated nukes from Buckfast Abbey, apparently. Just handling bees, and it was just busy. I would say repetitive, but it wasn't, because it was just therapeutic. It was just going through colony after colony, perhaps spending a minute or two in each one. Now, just watching Mike here, he prefers to use that style of hive tool, but I would use the J type tool to help lift it up. And so it's got me thinking about what sort of hive tools I prefer and how I could use them. Lots of lifting and moving around, but the tool has, as he's using it there, is very useful because you can use that as a lever to jam the frames together or pull them apart. But he's checking through a previous batch where the queen's been released, and that's the queen. He says, yeah, there it is. And he's just making sure that she's laying okay, everything's healthy and happy. So this would have been from a previous batch a few days or weeks before. Mike spent a lot of time explaining what was going on, which was just as well, because like I said, it can be quite intimidating seeing stuff like this, which is just a lot of beehives in a place, but it all makes sense, he says. I wouldn't want to have to explain it all right now to you, but yes, he's just got what he would call a brood factory here. Again here. I actually was really taken by the boxes, the brood box at the bottom, which has got a split in half with a queen on each side, and then the nuke boxes up above that, because I've run brood boxes for my brood, but I also run brood boxes for my super. The only downside to that is a box, a brood box, national brood box of honey is about 25 kilos, and this immediately halves the weight by doing it like this. And I've always got nuke boxes available if I want them. If you can see on some of these as well, they've got holes in the side of the nuke boxes. Because the bees were so busy, they would have several entrances and the bees would forage and return, but they tend to return back to different holes, or yeah, they pick the same holes each time for themselves, but they'd be coming in through several holes just to keep the sheer volume of nectar coming in. Don't know exactly what this one is. Oh, this is me just looking around the apiary. This is it's a jungle. It's a jungle of bees. There's no other way to describe it. And you can see them just everywhere. I was so taken by this. It was an amazing experience. Just everywhere you looked were just bees. Over in the background there, I think are some of the breeder hives, just single boxes and bees everywhere. And then as we move around a bit, that's where the cells were being raised, he says, because you probably see busier bees at the front. Yeah, so just the ones just to the left there. But it's an absolutely amazing experience to see something like this and to wander around and experience it. The noise, just a constant hum of bees. It sounded like a swarm, just constant with the buzzing, but it wasn't a swarm. It was just there were so many bees going off and doing their business. Uh, we had good weather, and by good, I mean it was warm. It wasn't too dry, but sometimes it did rain, and so they would put a gazebo up, and sometimes it needed a bit of a rain mac, but it was business as usual. The weather could not stop the process because the process was running to a fairly strict timetable, particularly those that are raising queens. You sort of know that you have to stick to the timings, otherwise it can go wrong quite quickly. But because they were doing sort of 48 or 96 at a time, they really could not afford to skip a day or wait a day for the weather to pass. So they just had to get on and do it anyway. Little things like this, you see a hive door being put into a smoker before, and they go to the next apiary, but this is sterilizing the hive tool. And I'd never even thought about doing that. Normally I would use some sort of soda crystals and so on, but this is such a simple idea and highly effective. More beer. This is at Mike's house again. Mike and Roger had, I think, about an hour or an hour and a half chat here. They were just preparing, we were getting the microphone sorted out. But Mike gave so sort of freely and kindly of his time and experience and shared a lot with us. We'll aim to get more videos out on the content of these because we went into a lot of detail and it you couldn't do it justice just by sort of giving some excerpts on a short talk like this. Yeah. And Rodriguez and Jorge. So guy on the left was Mexico, guy on the right from Puerto Rico. They'd come over to sort of learn, but they were learning by immersion. And they told us about beekeeping in their countries and what they were going to be bringing back from here, back to their country. They've got their own apiaries. I think Jorge on the right, there was some kind of massive storm um, or something going through Puerto Rico at the time, so he was a little bit worried about damage to his property and everything back home. Yeah, more interviews, and I don't know. Yeah, again, just this impression. It was almost overwhelming at the beginning to see all this, but then it was such a joy at the end of it just to be there. It just felt like you'd gone to heaven. Oof, bit of a list here. Stuff I knew, but it hit hard or hit home. It is possible to keep bees and use minimal protection and smoke. I hadn't realized. I know I tend to only wear a veil and no gloves given a choice, but to get to the point no veil, I've got that as an aspiration now of what excellent looks like. Yeah, you can't have too many bees in a soul raiser. Um, I was a little bit taken aback just how many they kept pouring in until they wouldn't fit in the box anymore. When I make nukes up, I might make two up or four up, sometimes six or 10. I hadn't made 50 before in a go, but I'm up for it from now. Keep it to the schedule on queen rearing. I think that's just a bit of a given. Never deviate. They had dates baked in, and whatever the weather, we had a threat of a tornado, I believe, coming through, but that even that didn't stop um, the whole routine. It just carried on. Nuke boxes as half supers, like I said, I was very impressed by that. And marking queens, doing splits. Once you set up, it's easy just to do a lot of them. The labeling, I think, is important, certainly when you're doing lots. And if you are grafting from multiple queens, just try to keep the traceability. And yeah, abundance of bees, spread your mated nukes out, different colors. We know that. Some new stuff to me. I'd say it's brand new, but in many cases, but yeah, the double queen split brew box gives stability at the bottom, and then the nuke boxes above is great. I make my own boxes, so what I saw from that is I could run two colonies under one floor, one stand, and one roof. So I've halved the amount of roofs and stands that I need to make, and I can run two colonies under each roof. Yeah, the hive tool in the smoker, like I said, yeah, I've never heard that or learnt it or been told it before, but it's so obvious as soon as you see it. And the two-way mating nuke was good advice to be shared. I like the idea of AP registrations in Vermont. I wish we had it here. Perhaps it might be selfish of me, but it would be lovely if you had no other apiaries within 2 miles of your own bees, because they could probably be able to cherry pick all sorts of forage then and have some very good stocks of honey and bees. Setting up the standardized nuke box, I said the nose thing, nectar, open brood, sealed brood, empty. it just setting them up in minutes and just going raking through other colonies and taking some of the spare surplus from the brood factory, as it was sort of called, taking those out and making up more colonies almost instantly. And in that breeder hives, I've got some which got, if you like, my favorite queens in, but the idea of having a vertical queen excluder 3 frames in, you know where the queen is, but you also know that she's laying the eggs up, and so it'll be young larvae when it's time to do the grafting. And that's it. I hope that's okay. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but it was a lot going on, raising hundreds of queens, making up many dozens of nukes, and with a whole raft of different people coming in. It was unclear whether they were volunteers or paid or something, but people just seemed to turn up from an hour's drive away, and it all seemed to work in the most wonderful way. It's probably the best beekeeping experience I've had in my life. So yes, I'll unshare this if I can figure it, and then
Thanks
happy
very
to
much,
chat.
Carl. Yeah,
Stop sharing.
that was eye-opening. I mean, the scale, the number of queens, the number of bees to support that, and the
Hmm.
calmness of them, incredible. Yeah, we'll open it up for questions now. If anybody on YouTube watching wants to ask a question, post it in chat, and I'll pass it on to Carl. But anybody in the room, do you want to kick off? Got a couple of questions. John asks, when they were making up the nukes, what was the process for ensuring the queen wasn't transferred with the frames, the nose?
Uh, they, the queens in all the colonies were marked, and when they were looking to a hive, certainly for example, to get frames out from one colony to the next, the first job all the time was to find the queen. Yeah, and if they couldn't find the queen, it was then just a slightly slower job of checking each frame to make sure the queen wasn't on it when they were transferring across. But yes, the small d discipline of finding the queen each time. As soon as you found her, you can then, within reason, sort of dismantle the rest of the hive and make up 4 or 5 dukes from it quite quickly. Once you got into the rhythm of it, it was really easy.
Yeah. And question from Victoria, does Mike use queen excluders between boxes horizontally?
I didn't see any other than on the breeder hives. We didn't look at any of his honey making colonies because I think collectively we were much more interested in the queen rearing side. Looking at the honey making colonies would have just been a sort of fairly repetitive thing, and we didn't get to those apiaries. I didn't ask. I don't know if you know, Roger.
There was a thumping great pile of them in the shed,
Yeah.
so almost up to my waist. So
Yeah.
he'd used them somewhere. We didn't actually see the honey producing colonies, which I'm not saying I was disappointed about because there was plenty to see. But if we'd had an extra day, I'd like to have gone and seen some of his queen producing, his honey producing colonies. But it was getting toward, well, not, yeah, halfway through the season, let's say, and most of his work for the honey production colonies was done, and it was really just producing nukes and queens at that time.
Okay. Thank you.
Question from Tim, who asked how they were avoiding wax moth destroying the frames of brood that they had in storage. What was their method?
I have no idea. I don't think they stayed in storage long enough by the look of it. The frames were moving around on the truck, off the truck. I mean, probably the most valuable thing we can have is drawn comb, and it needs looking after. But there was a lot of propolis on all of the frames, and many of these frames were, I would say, certainly more than a decade old, and being used, time and time again. I didn't see any wax moth. I don't know if you did, Roger. There
Well,
were bits of it.
thinking about it, I suspect the climate has something to do with it because don't forget during the winter it gets very cold there. I mean they can have hives buried in snow.
Yeah.
So it's going to be cold, and it's certainly going to knock most of them out, I think, and it could take them some time to recover.
Yeah.
I didn't see very many, if any, at all.
He did have lots of his boxes shrink wrapped, so to speak, in what I would know as cling film, but that's probably some packaging type version of it. So, and they weren't shrink wrapped as a whole lot, they were shrink wrapped as separate batches. And I do something slightly similar, not shrink wrapping, but I will stack a few boxes up and then put a piece of yoga mat every third box. And then if a wax moth gets in, they can have a field day on 3 boxes, but the rest of them tend to be okay. I suspect he's got something
I
similar.
think it's what we just call pallet wrapping. It's like stretch and seal, but much tougher and half a metre wide.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple of answers because it seems that Mike is watching on YouTube.
Oh my word! Oh, I'm sorry, Mike. I've done it wrong.
So Mike says he doesn't use excluders on production hives, and he lets winter kills the wax moth larvae.
Well, thank you, Mike. Now I'm yeah. I need to pay more attention and give more polite answers, I think. Yeah.
Now we know why there was a pile of excluders in the shed. He didn't use them.
Well, when you said that, I've got a pile of excluders in my shed because I don't put them on my hives. Yeah. Any more?
We've got a couple more questions here in chat. So, did they have colonies raising drones specifically?
We didn't discuss that. There were drones for sure around. I didn't see any drone combs specifically on frames, but there were drones in the colonies. So I don't think it was a deliberate effort, but there was so many hives, even if each of them only had a relatively sort of normal or small amount of drones in, I think it would have been able to flood the area with his sort of preferred genetics. And again, because there are so many colonies, the risk of inbreeding was extremely low, in my view.
Yeah.
I've made a few notes, if you don't mind. I know it's your talk, Carl, but the bees, I think they were largely based on Italian and Carniolan, because the Italian would be the yellow stripes, and the Carniolan, if you looked at the abdominal segments, the tormenta are about half the width and also quite light. So I suspect they're Carniolan Italian mixture. There was absolutely no clipping of queen's wings, not for selling, which actually surprised me. But he didn't do it, and I don't think he had a swarming problem, so there's no need to. Another thing that was an issue with him was that there were southern beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, moving their hives around, and I think they just dumped their bees for a time in Vermont. How they went about the licensing, I don't know. The registration, I don't know. Something perhaps Mike can answer at some stage. But what it did do was the genetics were soft southern bees, and they were mating with his queens, which did upset his breeding program a little bit.
Yeah, I mentioned about this sort of 2-mile radius between apiaries, which I applaud, but I think Mike was mentioning that some commercial people look to see where there are little gaps between all of these circles, and they can then dump some of their migratory bees there, and then they have a big influence on the apiaries around them, and then they'll move on to another pastures new in due course, and then the local beekeepers just have to deal with the consequences.
Okay. Couple more questions in chat. Paul asks whether solid floors are used in all the hives of nukes.
Yes, I saw that through all of them. I don't think there was any mesh floors, and the boxes were old and gnarly, but solid and fully functional. So it's just a continuous use of the boxes. What I thought was very high throughput of queens, in the mating nukes.
Yeah. And Tim asks, with so many hives in a small area, were there any issues with robbing of the nukes?
I didn't see any. When we were searching for queens, we were taking boxes apart, and they weren't disturbing the boxes adjacent to it. And then we had, I think, about 3 sections of the mating apiary, and although one section was being worked on and the queens harvested and then the queen cells put in, the other sections were completely oblivious to what was going on with all the people around and vehicles and things. As I mentioned, things like horses. The bees were calm, and I think that's a sort of testimony to Mike's selection processes on and sort of bee improvement regime that he's gone through. They were an absolute joy to work with.
Yeah, what Carl didn't show was that in between those boxes there were horse droppings in some cases. So the horses were actually going in between the beehives. Nothing seemed to get knocked over, and there were three ponies in there, weren't there? So
I did squeeze one picture in with the horses
yeah,
at near the beginning, but yeah,
I believe the 3, but there was evidence of them being in amongst the hives.
Yeah.
Absolutely no trouble.
Yeah, go on. Sorry, Carl.
Any more for any more?
Yeah, a couple more. So we've got did the grass stay in the cell builder until just before the queens emerged, or did they get moved into a sort of queen right finishing hive first? No, they stayed, didn't they?
Yeah.
In the cell builder. Day 14 or something.
Yeah, when we were looking at what was going on, we were jumping around sort of randomly. So cycle 3, we were on stage 2, and then cycle 4 was on stage 1, and then cycle 2 was just finishing. So the order that we worked on the bees was different from, if you like, the logical order that I tried to take it through on the talk today. I mean, the first thing we did was catch queens, which is the end of the cycle almost, isn't it? And that's just the way the days worked out. But Mike took us through 3 sort of rounds of doing that, because each round is 4 days worth of effort, and we were there for 12 days, and then we were able to untangle it, understanding what we were doing on each of the days that were similar. It sounds complicated. It was at the time when we were trying to fit it all together, because we were seeing the 2/3 of the way through the process, then the beginning, then the end, and then somewhere near the middle, and then having to just re-put those jigsaw pieces together afterwards. So Martina's good. She got a spreadsheet going, so we could get all the timings right and understand what was going on.
Paul asks, do you know if any sugar syrup was used to help feed bees during spring or autumn?
I didn't see any at all, and there were no containers, the IBC type containers around. There was 0 feed, but I don't think it was an issue. I mean, there was a lot of nectar and honey around. Mike might have a different idea of what we define as a lot, but there was an abundance of resources when we went in June.
Okay. And a question on Mike's methods of prevention or control of AFB and EFB.
I don't know how prevalent it is in America, but obviously they're fully aware of it, and they were doing their checks. And there was a point where we weren't sure about something with one of the colonies, so we went through and disinfected all of our equipment and sorted it all out before moving on to the next apiary. weren't sure, but it was plain safe. We had a liquid wash and the sort of heat disinfectant route as well, and we washed our hands and everything.
I
So
think in one of Mike's National Honey Show videos, he stated that he hasn't had foul brood for a long time.
yeah. Yeah.
But of course,
Well,
there's no inspection service over there like we've got.
Mike's replied on the syrup on YouTube and said he feeds the cell builders 1 gallon on grafting day.
okay, Mike. I trust him on that one. We didn't see that being done, but I'm not sure you could fit a gallon in anywhere because it was full of bees.
I believe some of the hives, I think, had feeders, frame feeders, didn't they? There was just so much to see. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was somebody else.
There was a lot to take in. We've got hundreds of photographs and many dozens of videos. I've tried to give you a sort of good sample to show it, but it's probably less than a fifth of what we've got. And as you look at each photograph in detail, you find more and more things out that were interesting, if you like, but it doesn't always clock together until you're looking at it afterwards. One cold January morning.
And we will share more of the video footage on our YouTube channel in coming weeks as well. So more to follow up on. Paul asked, where did all the pollen come from that was padded into the cells?
We didn't see pollen traps being used, I don't think.
Yeah, I did. They were underfloor pollen traps, and I think they were the OAC ones, the Ontario Agricultural College ones, I believe. But Mike showed me he took a draw out with pollen in. So I think that's where he got it from.
Yeah. See, Roger gets preferential treatment. Yeah. Or I wasn't paying attention. Yeah. There was a lot to take in. But obviously pollen is a key part of it. And I was a little bit taken aback, but then very impressed by how much pollen they were giving. And a simple lesson for me is I'd rather give double or treble what's required than just try to give enough. And that seemed to be the sort of routine that they had. And I think it's a very sensible routine.
Okay. I think that's most of the questions. There's quite a lot of comments. Some viewers in the US saying they volunteered and that volunteers come from all over, and they volunteer because they just love the experience of doing it with Mike. Sort of
I felt like people volunteered, but I'd never quite understood all the relationships other than these people all just turned up at the right time and knew what to do and knew each other, and just if someone new came into the equation, they were welcomed in the same way that we were, and just sort of, I won't say put to work because that's not the right way. We were able to contribute and learn and experience stuff as we chose, really. It was never hard work, but you just wanted to join in. I made a particular effort of trying to get as many notes as I could, because the notes will be my long-term investment. And I hope to be able to carry on doing this for another decade and a half. And so those learning points I never want to lose. But it was quite easy to get drawn into just joining in and catching queens and making nukes and just getting dirty and just allowing the day to just be immersed in bees.
One final question in here. from Paul. Do you recommend the nectar that you had at the end of each day? Was it mead or homemade?
It was a very strong beer, actually. Um, it I was partial to a certain type of beer that Mike, once he clocked that, there was always one available for me, and he had a big fridge full of beers in his workshop as well, which I was very impressed with, and that's something I must copy. Yeah, but it was hot, like I said, up to 30 degrees. I struggled when it got above 25. Obviously, they're probably more used to it, but you do get dehydrated during the day, and to have a beer at the end of the day was both refreshing, but it was also just it was nice just to share a bit of food and drink together, because it did bring us together quite a lot, just the experiences. I mean, you said Mike's listened to this, but I just can't get over how kind and generous he was with his time and his
Yeah.
experience. And yeah, I'll always remember that experience. That was probably the most impactful 12 days of beekeeping I've had in my life.
Brilliant. Good. Okay.
Yeah, thank you everybody for listening to it. It's the first time I've given this talk. It was prepared fairly sort of briefly, and just to give you an impression of what it's like in a busy, productive, sustainable apiary, and how raising queens is a lot of work when you're doing them in very large numbers, but it's also an absolute joy. And I'm much more motivated to have a steady stream of queens coming out of my bees in the future, rather than doing it in a more sort of patchy or sporadic way than I have done in the past. It seems like a continuous stream during the course of the summer is probably the best way for me to do it, because then I know what's happening on each cycle. So thank you very much for coming along, and I hope that's okay. And I wish you well in your beekeeping season for next year. And thank you so much for your patience and your questions.
Thank you, Carl. And if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do subscribe. We'll have more content from the visit to Mike Palmer as in the following weeks.
Yes, thank you to Mike if he's still there, but much appreciated. We'll be back the same time next year.